There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. As if I need to even say anything, is this new blouse came in the mail. I got 3 new blouses in the mail from China or something, and I was worried that they weren't ever, what might be some kind of a fraud thing, but no, just they were backlogged and it came, and I love it. It's more of a kind of a spring color, but it cheers me up in drab November, so here it is. I'll have new blouses to debut for the next few weeks. I have things to tell you. Not a lot of reading updates, but some one particular substantive one, and a new book I'll be starting. We'll get to that later in the broadcast or podcast. It's funny, guests who aren't familiar with kind of YouTube channels or BookTube, they don't know what to call this. Is it your show, your podcast, your broadcast? What is it? And just don't call me late for dinner. You can call me anything you like, what I do here. And speaking of, my big news, my big personal news, or my big channel news, let's put it the most accurately, is, well, I didn't get any new patrons after mentioning it again for the first time in a long time last week. 2 of my ongoing previous supporters have reached out with even more generous contributions to what I'm doing here, and I'm very, very grateful to them. Very generous supplemental support above and beyond what they have given me in the past. So that has meant the world to me. I would like to thank my top tier subscriber, Melanie from Washington State, who not only recently renewed her annual subscription at that top tier level, but has given me a further very generous contribution. And thank you, Melanie, my goodness. And another contributor who's not on Patreon, Kathleen from New Mexico, sent me a generous PayPal donation to my efforts about a year ago now, and sent an even larger, double the size contribution the same way last weekend. So thank you so much, Kathleen. So, and I guess I should mention that you don't have to go through Patreon at all if you want to help me out. And my PayPal email address is in the show notes. I'm just going to say one sentence about the Patreon thing. Starting this month, there's going to be a 30% surcharge on Patreon memberships. New Patreon memberships if you join through the Apple iOS app. To get around that 30% extra charge that goes straight to Apple, the greedy buggers, just subscribe on your browser through Patreon or on Android. That's all I'll say about it. I talked about it at length last week. But like I say, I haven't had a new Patreon except 2 people that I know personally in 2024, so I think I'm taking up valuable airtime to even mention it. However, I'm really grateful for the ways that these lovely people have provided so much support. So thank you. Well, I have to say a word about the election. I'm really on pins and needles about it. I think Kamala's going to win. I don't know what I'm going to do if she doesn't. I don't know what any of us are going to do. I'm going to ask Mom if she can offer up her bedroom suite to the Obamas or Liz Cheney, because, I mean, those people got to get out of the country. Anyway, I'm not going to go off on a tangent or commentary. That's not why you're here, but it's all-encompassing, and it's eating into my reading life and my reading time and my thinking time, because it's so incredibly important. So let's hope that we're all in a better mood and more relaxed by next Friday, shall we? All right, without further ado, I have another fabulous, wonderful mystery guest this week. Let's go meet them. And this week's mystery guest is the Canadian writer Connie Gault, joining us from London, Ontario. Although she hails from the West, she's a Saskatchewan-born and raised writer and has been living in Eastern Canada, in Ontario, for just about 3 years. I attended the book launch of Connie Gault's most recent novel, The Rasmussen Papers, in June, and it was launched in May. So Connie Gault, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
That was a wonderful night. You and Marlis Wessler, who was my mystery guest last week, launched together, and it was a standing room only event.
Yes, Marlis and I have been old friends. We have been friends, so now we're old friends. Yeah, we've been friends for decades.
So, Connie, tell us a bit about the Rasmussen papers.
Okay, so this is a novel. I would say I call it a takeoff on a novel written by Henry James. That book was called The Aspirin Papers. I read it just before I started to write this novel, and I thought about I didn't like the way he used his women characters. I should stop and say, I'm a big fan of Henry James. I've read a lot of his novels and really appreciate them for many good reasons. But in this one, I thought he was off on those women characters. I didn't think he gave them their due. And I thought, oh, it'd be so much fun to write this book the other way around. And instead of having a male editor go into a house that's owned by two women, I'd like to have a woman who wants to do a biography go into a house belonging to two men. So that's how it started, just as a fun kind of thing. And I thought, oh, I'll just dash it off, or I'll just write a little bit and quit because, I don't want to take on Henry James, really. But what happened was I got quite intrigued by my own characters, and I kept writing. And then I decided, well, I don't think I'll publish it. I'll just give it to my friend Joan Givner, who once taught me a class at the U of R of Regina. She taught me a class called The Art of Biography. And she's a biographer herself. So I thought, well, this would amuse her. And I gave it to her, and it did amuse her, and she enjoyed it and encouraged me to keep working on it because I was already working on it. So her encouragement helped. Yeah, and that's how it came about. And it's just about a woman who really, really, really wants to write a biography of her favorite poet, a poet whose work she just adores. And she's willing to do almost anything and some of it, like a lot of biographers I have heard, get into some trouble because they want their hands on certain papers belonging to other people. And to get those papers, sometimes they rely on some subterfuge. And so that's what happens in this book. She finds her way into the house of the former lover of this poet and tries to get hold of those papers that he actually owns. And he's 100, so that's complicating things. Or 99 when the book starts.
Although without wanting to indulge in stereotypes, you probably would take frequent naps, so that might help.
He does do that.
So we better talk about this right away. I'm planning to read, I have not read the Aspirin Papers, but I'm planning to read it first and then go directly to your novel. You say that's not necessary. Readers do not have to have read the Aspirin Papers to appreciate your novel.
I've heard from many readers who say they have not read the Aspirin Papers, but they still enjoyed this one.
Okay. I have another motive to read Henry James again after a long break. I studied him at grad school at York University in Toronto many years ago. My experience of grad school in English literature was not positive. So that kind of tainted my experience of Henry James, although I do think that I can separate that out and say that I really don't like Henry James myself. So that's a good reason for me to read something I've never read by him and give him a fresh chance. But I think I quoted when you signed my book at the book launch, a remark attributed to Thomas Hardy, but I can't find any proof. But it was in a lecture Alistair MacLeod gave that I attended many years ago, where he said, Thomas Hardy once said of Henry James, he chewed more than he bit off.
But it seems so true, especially his later books. He did. So apparently he dictated those later books, and that is possibly what happened.
Well, his style just got so.
Why he got very wordy.
Yeah, he revised almost all of his earlier stuff. The one that he didn't think was worthy of his time to revise is the Bostonians, and that's the one I like the best.
I really like the Bostonians. It's a really good read.
It is. It's excellent.
Yeah, I like a lot of his writing. I think the reason I like it is because he creates characters who engage me as a reader, and then he always puts them into a situation into an ethical situation and challenges them like say, how are you going to behave now when you really want something? And so that's what I did with the Rasmussen papers. She really wants to write this biography. And it was fun to see how far she would go, even while she's telling herself she shouldn't.
And a few years ago, when you decided to read the Aspirin papers, was that with the idea of writing something in response, or the rest of it came kind of spontaneously after it?
No, it was just, I said to somebody, to my friend, probably it was Marlis Wessler, actually, I think it was. I said, I feel like reading Henry James, but I've read so much and I don't want to read one of the last novels because they're too big and heavy. And she said, oh, what about the Aspirin papers? Have you read that? And I had not. So I immediately got hold of it and read it. And as I said, I had some misgivings about the way he handled the women. So that was a spur that got me kind of, lots of times having something to kind of fight against is a good thing for a writer.
Have any of your previous novels or any works of fiction or drama, have they ever been in reaction to or a takeoff on another literary work, or was this kind of a new way to get started?
I think this was quite new for me. And it was
Yeah.
also, if you want to learn how to use plot, he's a good guy to emulate too, because, and in fact, I got carried away and added a few extra twists and turns to the plot. But I basically used his rough outline of his plot. And it does teach you quite a bit about plotting. And I haven't been very much a fan of plotting, so it was fun to do it.
And it's set in contemporary Toronto's Cabbagetown, among the marginalized and dispossessed. Can you tell us a little bit more about the setting?
Yeah, when I started thinking about actually writing this, I had sort of the character in mind, the main character in mind, what was going to happen in mind. I didn't know where to set it. Like the Aspirin Papers is set in Venice. So I think like, oh, I can't do that. I've been there, but no, I don't know it very well. And so, well, at the time I was sitting in a very nice home in Cabbagetown. We were house sitting for friends and sitting at their kitchen table writing little notes about how this novel might go. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just set it here and see what happens. Because the city, or I think settings always become almost like a character. So they're really important and they contribute something. And in this novel, the setting really contributed a lot. It really made the novel because she goes out into the world. She's very cloistered in the first part of the novel. She stays in this house with these men and they're all talking about, well, they have various machinations going on among them. Then when she starts going out into the world, she gets more and more interested in all these people she meets, and they all have their opinions of her too. And she's watching them; they're watching her.
For people watching that don't know about Cabbagetown, can you describe what Cabbagetown is like?
Yeah, originally it's named after the fact that in these small homes in eastern, sort of downtown Toronto, people actually grew vegetables and often was cabbages because that's the most nutritious thing that you can use your ground for pretty much in those days. And they would grow in their front yards. And so it became Cabbagetown. Now, this place, this particular house is situated on Ontario Street, which is kind of at the very edge of Cabbagetown and an area of a lot of townhouses, but they're all older and about half of them now, no, more than that now, probably 3/4 or more are all fixed up. They've been bought, they've been renovated, they're now worth $2-3 million each, whereas they were rooming houses probably 50 years ago or 80 years ago.
I'm getting a vibe of gentrification in what you're saying.
Yeah, it's definitely gentrification. What happens still, though, is there are still some of these rooming houses. There are still some mental health facilities in that neighborhood. And so what has happened is it is a huge disparity. In Canada, it's probably the worst I've seen. in terms of people who have a ton of money walking up and down the sidewalks with people who have none. It's quite an education in how we get along, and even I can't say it's an education in why we get along, because I really don't understand why we get along. When you think about people who have so much money, they don't seem to be resented by the people on the street. So I don't know quite how that happens.
Well, it sounds like a really fascinating backdrop for the story that you're telling. So I can't wait to read this novel. My understanding of your work is that you first made your name as a playwright, and now you don't do so many plays and you focus more on prose fiction. Is that right?
Yes. Well, actually, I started out writing short stories. So I have 2 books of short stories, but I got kind of had a detour into playwriting, which I thoroughly enjoyed until I got too stressed out by it. It's a wonderful thing to put on plays. And I had I think 2 productions of each of my 4 plays that ended up getting published. And each time it's a real privilege to work with these talented people, It's so exciting because they're all working on your piece and they're all contributing these fantastic visions for it, and everything's really great. But there's so much pressure. And I was always feeling like if it's not a success for new plays, the bar is not that high, but you would think so in terms of the pressure involved. And so eventually I just thought, I'm not made for this, I need to be either tougher or quit playwriting. And so I quit.
Tell us about your favorite of your plays.
I think my favorite play is Otherwise Bob. And it was produced in Edmonton and Calgary at the same time with 2 different theaters. So that was fun. Yeah.
That was 1999, according to Wikipedia.
I guess so. It was quite the year for me. I kind of flew back and forth between the cities a few times to attend rehearsals. Why that was my favorite, I think it has something to do with all of my writing, which is it has a lot of emphasis on the peripheral characters. So there is a main character and her husband, and things happen to them. But the more exciting thing for me is these peripheral characters who come in and out of the action. And I think that's the same when I think about it with the Rasmussen papers as well. Those peripheral characters are the ones who actually make something happen in the novel. And I had a lot of similar with A Beauty, my last novel before this one. That also has a lot of kind of a constellation of characters. There is one main character, but they all have their own stories too. And I guess, yeah, for me, that's an enjoyable way to write.
Without wanting to inject liberal politics into our discussion, it takes a village to tell a good story.
Well, I mean, it's hard to avoid any kind of politics right now as we nail-bite our way to the U.S. election.
Oh my God, I think we should get to vote. It's going to affect
us. I know
it's
good because it's going to really make a big difference to us, isn't it?
Oh God, I'm almost to the point of losing sleep over it, but not
Me
quite.
Too.
But yeah, it's really.
Yeah, I know.
Really...
I'm quite tense about it.
Let's watch it together on Zoom and drink all through the hours.
I might have to take something else. Knock myself out.
If Wikipedia is up to date, and I know it's not because it doesn't have the Rasmussen papers listed, your last short story collection was 1996. So have you kind of gotten away from writing short stories, or just haven't had a collection published recently?
No, I haven't. I seldom write stories anymore. And when I do, they just kind of languish. I don't really do anything with them. I have an idea, I write the story, and then I put it away in one of my files on the computer. And, I don't really work on it the way I work on a novel. I just find a novel so satisfying to work on because the complexity of it, keeps you on your toes. And yeah, for some reason, it's just more satisfying for me to write.
What are you working on now, Connie?
I have an old new manuscript and a new manuscript. So I can't talk about the new one, but the old new one has a good solid draft. So I have some people reading it. My agent is reading it, and an editor friend of mine is reading it. So I'm waiting for some feedback, and I'm pretty sure I can get it published. I hope so, because I really like it. It's a novel about two women, and they met about, I can't remember if it's 61 or 62 that they met. One was 13 and the other was 22 at the time. And the 13-year-old watched the 22-year-old kill a man.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yes. So and they have not met until just recently during the COVID thing. They know each other exists, but they have had nothing to get. So it's in two parts, the novel. It's kind of like an anti-detective novel. Well, actually, it is a kind of detective novel because the younger woman wants to find the older one, but she doesn't know how to.
I'm not going to make the same joke that I made with Marlis last week and say, I hope it isn't autobiographical.
No, it's not. Seems like Marlis and I and our friend Dianne Warren too. I think she's also writing a novel with a murder in it or some kind of death. So I don't know why we're all on that. Maybe we all got talking one day and influenced each other.
Oh, that's really interesting. I just recently acquired Dianne Warren's, what's it called? Her most famous one, the one that won the big award,
Pool water.
Cool Water. And I
Yeah.
haven't read it yet, but I read the first page and was just complete. I wanted to keep reading at that moment. So I can't wait to finally get
It's
to that.
wonderful. It's really a wonderful novel.
So
And very Saskatchewan.
very Saskatchewan.
But
Absolutely.
on that topic, I should also say about this novel, the Rasmussen papers, I mean, that the woman who invades the house of the two men is from Saskatchewan.
Well, there
And
you go.
that's quite important. She's a Saskatchewanian. Do we say that? Saskatchewanian in Toronto.
That's how I pronounce it. And I'd like to hear about what kind of books you like to read, Connie. I think you've got a few to recommend.
Yeah, I do. I wanted to recommend Joan Barfoot's Critical Injuries. I don't know if you've ever read her.
I have not. I've got her on my radar with another book.
Okay, Critical Injuries was her second last novel. It was long listed for the Booker. Her first novel, Abra, was
That's the one I've heard about.
yeah. Did you hear about that from that blacklisted?
Yes, I
Okay.
did.
Me
Yes.
too. Yeah, so that was really cool. Hey, I had met Joan at Sandra Birdsall's place one time in Regina when Joan happened to be going through. And I knew she lived in London, Ontario, but I had no way of getting in touch with her. I didn't know quite. And then through Facebook, she replied to something on Facebook, and then I said to her, "Say, I just heard a podcast that talked about your novel, Abra, and are you still in London? And do you want to have a glass of wine someday?" And she got back to me and said yes. So I've met her a few times here in London, which is really, she's a lovely, lovely person and such a fantastic writer. And Critical Injuries is super and a very, very satisfying novel, just totally satisfying. And the thing I love about her writing is it's so matter of fact. Feels to me like that's the kind of thing we need right now. Somebody who's got some what used to be called common sense. It's about two people who meet by accident. One is a middle-aged woman who's very happy with her life, and she happens to go into a store one day to get an ice cream cone for herself and her husband, and runs into a kid who's robbing the store, and he happens to have a shotgun.
Happens to have. I'm going to just guess that that's pretty important to where the story goes next. Oh my goodness.
She gives you both characters through the next several, I think it's a couple of years, and what happens to each of them. I'm always astonished by the low-key wisdom Carol Shields called the novel wise, funny, and harrowing.
So it must have been published quite some time ago.
Oh,
Sadly,
it
to
was
get a
quite
blurb
a
from
long.
Carol Shields.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think it was 2001. I'm not sure.
Before you go to the next one, I just want to get
Okay.
another word in about Abra and
Oh,
that
yeah.
incredible podcast conversation. That guest on the backlisted podcast that sang the praises of Abra, that Scottish writer, her name is
Uh-huh.
Rose Ruane. She was a mystery guest on my channel a few months ago. So I'm
You're
going to
kidding.
send you the link. You could hear what a colorful person and interesting person she was, but you got to see her for the full effect. So I'll send you a
Yeah,
link.
that's
And
good.
for my viewers that haven't seen that episode, it's just incredible. I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Okay. Now, I didn't really know for sure if it's okay to recommend a book of poetry.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
I don't know if you know Wisława Szymborska, her
Yes, I
poetry.
do. Yes, I do.
Yeah. So she's was a Polish writer. I think she died in 2012, and she won the Nobel Prize for
Did.
literature. That's how I came across her. That's how I found her. And what I noticed, I was like, I read her book all the time. Now, this is embarrassing, right? Look at all this. That
No, that's the sign of a real poetry reader.
Not only that, if you think that's bad, there's a whole bunch of dog-eared pages too. So almost everyone is wonderful. What I like about her, again, like sort of like Joan Barfoot, she's that has that real grounded sense, that real no nonsense. I see I see what's going on. Not that she always knows and she never preaches, but it's always with a quite a wry sense of humor, very observational. The Los Angeles Times Book Review said her wry acceptance of life's folly remains her strongest weapon against tyranny and bad taste. I
That's
thought that was
wonderful.
really great.
The highest compliment I know how to pay to her is that I've read one of her books of poetry, and I don't really read poetry. I would say I'm not really a big poetry person, and I absolutely loved it. So,
Yeah, she's just fantastic. Can I read just about 4 or 5 lines to you?
yes, please, absolutely.
This is one poem I really love. It's called A Moment in Troy, and I'll just read the first lines. Little girls, skinny, resigned to freckles that won't go away, not turning any heads as they walk across the eyelids of the world, looking just like mom or dad and secretly horrified by it. In the middle of dinner, in the middle of a book, while studying the mirror, may suddenly be taken off to Troy.
Oh my God, that's incredibly powerful. Walking across the eyelids of the world.
Yes,
Oh, jeepers.
isn't that just like, ooh?
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. What a wonderful recommendation.
My third one is actually an ebook by Sarah Polley, her book Running Towards Danger or Running Towards the Danger.
I have not read it. I've heard nothing but superlative reviews of it.
Yeah, it's a
Mm.
fascinating account of her, of not a biography really, but biographical essays. I think there are maybe 7 in there, something like that, and of different times in her life. And what an interesting life the woman's had. A child actor, became a director, a Academy Award winning screenwriter. But a lot of the book is kind of grounded in her body, which is also interesting. If you ever wonder what it's like to have the body of a woman, and especially one that hasn't always worked well for her, that becomes really interesting. Her title, Running Towards the Danger, is interesting too. And she has tried to do that in her life in order to overcome certain things that she needed to overcome. But also in her writing, she does that, obviously. She doesn't shy away from examining what's happened to her and what her role in what happened to her is as well.
Yeah, it just sounds incredible. So
It
I
is.
must get to that. I
Yeah.
absolutely must. So that's a very welcome recommendation. Putting her back on my radar. Connie Gault, you've recommended some really fascinating sounding books, but I still am most interested in reading yours. So thank you so much
Thank you.
for being my guest. And I hope once I have read the Rasmussen papers, I'd love to have you come back and we can have a deeper dive kind of chat about that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Shawn.
That was a very exciting conversation, and I look forward to more such conversations with Connie Gault, who's a good friend of Sharon Butalis, by the way, so we might have to set up a three-way conversation sometime. That would be really fun. Okay, I've been a little busy this week. The one big video that took me forever to edit, it was a joy to edit because it was a wonderful conversation with two Irish writers, Ronan Hession and Kaveri Madhavan, about their latest novels. Ronan's latest novel is Ghost Mountain. Kaveri's is The Inheritance. And that lengthy Zoom colloquy went up on my channel a few days ago. And both of those novels, as you might remember me waxing passionately about in a recent Friday Reads, are very well worth your time. And probably many of you are hearing about them for the first time on my channel, unless you live in the UK. So that conversation is well worth your time. And last night I put up another episode of Zooming In, my occasional series that got very, very occasional with all of the personal stuff that knocked me on the floor this year. But it's back, and I filmed a new Zooming In chat yesterday. But before that, I'm all caught up with a huge backlog of interviews that I taped before my life fell to pieces early this year, and I've only got one more of those that will be coming in the next couple of weeks, so I'm going to be looking for fresh interviewees going forward. Anyway, I got sidetracked there. The Zooming In chat that went up late last night is with Scott of Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, talking about parting with books, getting rid of books that we don't want to keep anymore, and it was a wide-ranging, dipsy-doodle-esque conversation about all the related issues of a voracious reader and how materialistic or not, or how paper book-centered that reading life is for both of us. So do check that out. The main thing I want to talk to you about reading-wise this week is I have both started and finished in the last 4 or 5 days this Australian novella, Panthers in the Museum of Fire by Jen Craig. This was a buddy read with Joe Smith. We're still trading messages about it, processing it. It was published in 2015. I just checked, and you can buy it outside of Australia. I think I splurged and bought it. Oh no, I think it's recently been reprinted, so you can get it, I think, fairly easily now. 6 or 8 months ago when I got my copy, I paid quite a bit for a used copy, but you don't need to splurge to get a copy now. Joe and I selected this book for our penultimate buddy read of the year, because this was the October pick for the Wafer Thin Books Book Club, an online discussion of thin little books, and that's why we read it when we did. But as it got closer to the end of October, we both realized we couldn't attend the Zoom book club discussion about the book because I work at that time. It was like a Monday at 7 p.m. my time, and she couldn't attend. So thankfully, the video of that book club discussion is now online. I'll put a link in the show notes. I haven't watched it yet, but I can't wait to watch it. This book, if you like Gerald Murnane, or if you loved Milkman by Anna Burns, the Booker Prize winning novel from Ireland, Northern Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, a few years ago, you will love this book. If you didn't like those long, spindly, fabulously headache-inducing sentences in those other books, this will not be a book for you. But this book knocked my freaking socks off. The present of the novella is Jen Craig, it's an autofiction, walking to meet somebody, to return something to them. I'm going to give you more of the setup by reading one of those long, fabulously headache-inducing sentences to you, which will give you a real taste not only of what this book is all about, but also the style. Jen is the first-person narrator and the name of the author. How autobiographical this is, I don't know. Don't really care. She's walking to meet this person, Pamela, to return something to her, and here is the sentence. Yes, I began to think again, forcing myself to return to my earlier reflections, so as not to be diverted from what I was trying now to understand as I walked towards Pamela and the cafe in Crown Street. Given how I had been feeling about the manuscript and the circumstances surrounding the passing on to me of the manuscript at the wake, and about the one-time, now deceased friend who had written it, to whom I had hardly spoken in years, as I explained to Raph last night, and whom I could still not tally with the coffin, the contents of the coffin, that disappeared while we were all being distracted by a song that went, as I told him, "Nothing compares to you." He might even remember this song. It was years and years old, but very popular at the time. It was strange that it should have been relief that I experienced after reading the manuscript, considering it was only my old friend Sarah who had written it. A relief that was euphoria, a euphoric relief. So, does that make you want to run out and grab a copy of the book? I hope so. What I found was that I couldn't read that kind of prose when I was tired, and late last night I had about 30 pages or something to read, and I decided to just begin reading it aloud to myself, and that kept me locked in immersively, and I think I got more out of those last 30 pages than I had up until then, but it was all a really immersive experience. But it's not for the... if those long sentences don't float your boat, you're not gonna like this book. I didn't even think of it until Joe used the phrase stream of consciousness, but of course that's what it is. It's a series of peripatetic rememberings and conceptualizations. The point of view is layered to the point where you literally, and I think you saw some of that in this sentence, you literally are experiencing her remembering something as she walks along the street on the way to this cafe. And what she's remembering is something that she was thinking about, let's say, yesterday, and where she was walking when she was thinking about that. And that memory goes back to a conversation she had with her best friend, Raph, the day before. And so you're juggling all of those time sequences. She's juggling them, and all of them are tied to a location that she's either moving through or sitting down in. And the story is that she is a frustrated writer. She's an artiste manquée. That was a phrase that I apparently told Ronan Hessian about in a chat, and he's taken it and run with it. I first found the term a writer manqué in Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way years and years ago, when I didn't think that was all nonsense. But I don't think it's nonsense. I just would like to see some book prize winners who publicly thank Julia Cameron for getting them started in writing. It's probably creatively stimulating, but I don't think it's going to produce writers that you or I are ever going to read. If you have proof that I'm wrong, I would love to hear it, and I would apologize to Julia Cameron publicly forever and ever. But anyway, where was I going with this? So Jan is a frustrated writer. She keeps her life structured so that there's room for writing in it, and she never does any writing. And she's maybe, I don't know how old she is actually. I think she's about 30-something. And her father is 79, and he has been very similarly a frustrated writer all his life. But at least he's been writing. He's written thousands of pages. That's all he does, is write all day. But he's kind of a Casaubon figure, and it never comes to anything. And he's now dealing with a terminal illness. And then she finds out that her old school friend, who she had lost touch with and never really cared particularly that much about, Sarah, has died. And at the funeral, Sarah's saccharinely sentimental fake sister gives her a manuscript that Sarah wrote, and our protagonist Jen does not want to take it. She tries to pretend to forget it, but the sister comes running as she's leaving the house and gives it to her. And then about 3 days later, the sister Pamela phones her back and says, "I've changed my mind. Please don't read it. Can you bring it back?" And so she's on her way back to the cafe, but she only ever decided to read it once Pamela phoned her and said, "Please don't read it." And then she read it, and it changed her sense of herself as a writer. And that is what the book is about. And there's a whole bunch more thematic, kind of biographical nuances to it, to do with body self-image, anorexia, death, and location is a really big part of it too. We read a lot about her house and so on. The physicality of being in a place, as well as the physicality and mobility of walking and thinking, and what kind of thoughts occur to her as she's walking compared to other thoughts that occur to her at other times. And all of that in these long, long, long sentences. And I just found it absolutely fascinating. I don't think it's going to be in my top 5 reads, but if I made a list of my top 5 most fascinating reads, rather than the top 5 books that I loved, this would be probably number 1. This was one of the most fascinating books I've ever read. I recommend it to you with all of the provisos I've given. And I think now I've probably said what I would say, so I probably won't do a full review, but I may change my mind after I watch the Wafer Thin Book Club video, if I feel I have more to say. But otherwise, that's what I have to say for now. Check out that Wafer Thin Book Club video, and if any of this sounds interesting, check it out for yourself. Wow. Oh, and by the way, I should say, Jen Craig is a guest on that Zoom book club discussion. I'm going to be starting one book this week, and it's a chunky bugger. And that is Sarah Waters' novel Fingersmith. It's set back in 1862, so some people, and I would disagree with this characterization unless I don't like it, in which case I would say, yes, this would be a work of historical fiction. Otherwise, I'm hoping it's a work of literary fiction, which is a very different thing. And this is for a pseudo-buddy read. I won't say who with. It'll be a celebrity. I'll keep you in suspense. This came out in 2002. And this was kind of as a dare, because this pseudo-buddy reader said, when I said the only Sarah Waters I had tried, I bailed on, it wasn't this one. She said, oh, for God's sakes, well, have you read Fingersmith? I said, nope. So here we go. I'm probably going to do it exclusively on audio so I can get it finished. But if I find the prose beguiling, or I fall out of love with the audiobook, which I just purchased, I'll read it. But anyway, it's I think it's very lesbian, isn't it? I hope so. And that is what I've got this week. Thanks so much for watching.